All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this last minute Cinderella story here on the eve of the great election of 2024. Myself and the homie Jacob Kishere are dropping in to do some last minute sense making around the whole thing, and yeah, just drop our 2 cents into the mix, into the swirling cauldron of possibility for what it's worth. And yeah, I'm just gonna lay out a little bit of how I'm feeling about things. Honestly, at this point, I don't feel like I'm it's kind of ironic to be recording a last minute podcast because that's mostly something you would expect to be doing if you were really trying to give a strong last minute push to one or the other candidate. I've seen a lot of that coming out in the last day or so, people's closing statements and such in support of their particular candidate. Where I'm at is honestly really deep in the unknowing right now. I'm really deep in the unresolvability of the whole thing and just the unresolvability of life itself. Just like the indeterminacy of everything. Everything is profoundly indeterminate and unresolvable in all of life. And when we're talking about something as of such gargantuan complexity as an entire global civilization or an entire national civilization, and the future of that civilization. I mean, I can't even we can't even know or resolve what our own immediate experience is and what it actually consists of, let alone the fabric of a superorganism consisting of 300 million people and all of the future possibilities thereof and all the different directions that can flow and all the variables and factors that are, you know, it's just, it feels preposterous for one human to try to, claim to know what's going on with that or where that's going to flow or what's going to be better or worse. And can't, we ultimately can't step outside of reality and assess whether reality is succeeding or failing in anything because we are reality itself, and none of us can ever step outside of reality to actually assess its condition from any kind of objective vantage point as well. So those are kind of the that's kind of where I'm at right now. I've been interestingly going through a fresh kind of plunge into the waters of non-duality and self-inquiry and kind of like Buddhist-y, no self type inquiry in recent days. So I found myself in kind of a fascinating place to be having this conversation. But that's kind of where I'm at. I will say that I did, yeah, I pretty much been in the unknowing and feeling like I wasn't going to vote for months. I did have a few moments of feeling like, oh, maybe I will vote for the Unity crew, like when RFK Jr. joined that squad, and when I started to get to know Tulsi Gabbard a little bit and feel inspired by her in certain ways, and when I contemplated Elon Musk potentially downsizing the massive government bureaucracy in the United States that employs over 2 million people, many of whom are probably you know, doing things that we don't need to be paying them tax dollars to be doing. You know, there have been different moments where I leaned more that way, and overall, I would say I have leaned a bit more that way in the direction of I should lean this way because there's child Donald Trump behind me and child Kamala Harris. Remind everybody of the youthful innocence of these characters, and I'm ultimately praying for both of them to be divinely guided, sending love to both of them, and yeah, so I leaned that way at times, but I never leaned that way enough that it pushed me over the edge to decide to vote, because there were too many other things that I saw that gave me pause, and I ultimately didn't want to validate some of what I see in Donald Trump, including a lot of very divisive, very fear mongering rhetoric, a lot of distortion of reality, a lot of self aggrandizement, and ultimately a man who I would not personally trust to babysit my daughter for even 5 minutes. And so I didn't want to give that person um, a vote. And yeah, that's where I'm at. I respect everybody's right to do what they're going to do and vote how they want. I respect people's right to instinctually or intellectually arrive at conclusions about which way to go. But that's where I'm at. So I'm curious to hear from Jacob here. Where are you at, brother? What's your read on this Rorschach test?
Yeah, fantastic opening. And yeah, I deeply appreciate the not knowing you're framing this in and the sense like to really land that sense of we really don't know. We really don't know what we're in. And just yeah, at a practical level, we don't know how our own life is going to unfold in 1 year's time. And we make plans and God laughs, right? So scaling that up is a very reasonable and logical thing to do. Um, I think, people who've been down the plant medicine path, I'm fresh out of a plant medicine conference at UBC in Vancouver this weekend, so I'm very present with that as well. People who've been down that path have had a recognition of the scale of change, not just on the material plane, but there's a change occurring in consciousness right now as well. And there's a whole host of really wild factors going into that, including AI, um, including extra dimensional interplanetary UAP type occurrences, including just the reality of globalization and the increasing interconnectedness of our consciousness with other consciousnesses that are different to our own. And all of which is to say that's no longer a fringe recognition, but that's something I think more and more people are recognizing. And so we can really hold that in this election. Um, Coming out of this plant medicine conference, I feel a renewed sense of the deep necessity to connect with our own divinity and to start to develop the capacity to be able to connect at that level with others collectively. And in a way, this is really one of the foundational problems that we're working with as a society. If we're thinking about what's causing the underlying rot, what's causing the corruption in systems, what's causing the loss of a goodwill um, within the American nation. Where does that spirit kind of reside? The inability to connect at that level in a community as an individual is a huge piece of that. And I do wonder how many of our um, pundits and commentators and influencers in the media are experiencing that deeper self, like deep connection with self and deep connection with others in which that lands. Um, and oftentimes actually the basis of the social network and the interconnection is career advancement or a kind of ideological inclusion and being part of the group and showing that you're part of the group, and kind of getting ahead by being part of that as well. So that's a huge factor at play here. Um, Usually I would attack this first from more of a political grounded place, but given the context that you brought in, I wanted to start more from the spirit of this. Um, and that's the ultimate project is how to actually land divinity into our bodies and into our relational context, and to begin to approach life from that place. Now, with that being said, as I was articulating to you before the call, I think we have to have both our feet in the dirt and we have to have our heads to the sky. And feet in the dirt in this case means two things. It means being grounded, right? Not losing our heads in the maelstrom, in this kind of increasing fire in a madhouse type situation. But it also means getting our feet dirty. And so in that sense, how can we be both beyond the fray and also intimate with it, true to it in a way? Perhaps a similar analogy would be with the wrestling with Christianity and the Christianity beyond itself projects that we've both been exploring a little bit. Is like you can't really hold the space for the community or hold the space for the shared field of value that you would like to see without also getting down into the communities that exist and the fields of value that exist, and getting up close and dirty and personal, and really feeling that from the inside. So in that context, I do look out at institutional corruption in the United States. I think that's a huge, huge piece of the puzzle here. I think that capitalism has had a corrosive effect on government over decades and decades, and there's been a lot of efforts at the fringe of U.S. politics going way back to when I was, watching the Young Turks when I was, in like high school, and thinking about Citizens United, thinking about campaign finance reform, thinking about Bernie Sanders as someone who represented an outsider to that. And so I've been someone who's always been drawn to and tracking who are those individuals who have a personal integrity and independence from this system, but who are also participating in it and seem to have some ideas about how to kind of cut to the core and cut to the meat of what's going on. Um, and with a view to that, I do feel that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s vision for the reform of the healthcare um, agencies, the reform of the food system, is one significant step in the right direction. Um, I think that the landscape of freedom of communication is under significant threat right now and has been since the COVID years. I think we're in a really unique situation in which there's a partnership between government and up until recently, all major platforms of communication, which creates the possibility of basically government enforcing a narrative, a narrative control around an issue, and then censoring opponents. And that's fundamentally unconstitutional and undemocratic. And also, the government has consistently shown that it doesn't really have the wisdom or the freedom from corruption to make super aligned decisions about what should be um, right and wrong and censored or uncensored. That's not really the place of government to do that. That's why there's the First Amendment, is the right to freedom of expression. So, with a view to this kind of free communication that we're having right now, preservation of the First Amendment is essential. Um, the Kamala Harris campaign would be a continuation of the Kamala Biden administration. She said that there's nothing she disagrees with about what they did during the administration. But that administration was actually uh, found to be backdooring with social media companies to try and target political opponents, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. during the COVID pandemic, um, and basically is in cahoots with this WHO government partnership, social media partnership system, that this kind of net of what is allowed and what is not allowed that's kind of closing around the internet right now. And so it's easy for us with the freedom of X and with this kind of like these pockets that have been carved out right now of free exchange to feel quite secure in that and to not be worried at an existential level about our freedom to communicate. But um, I would not be surprised if the powers that I associate with Harris, not simply just the administration, would seek to find ways to close those pockets, whether it be Rumble, whether it be X, and get to a place where there is more of a totality of control about what gets included and what doesn't. So those are kind of two initial pieces of why I think the unity ticket is important, why I think there are some kind of core American values. Um, and there is a true drive towards restoration and yeah, like restoration of the spirit of the republic through institutional reform, which the first Donald Trump presidency did not deliver on, as far as I can tell. And that was, that's what Robert F. Kennedy ran on. Is like Trump said he was going to drain the swamp, and he didn't drain the swamp. He filled it with swamp monsters, and he hired all of the heads of all of the, you know, he hired regulators to regulate all of the industries that they were already a part of. So that's a little bit of the landscape. I'd be happy to get more into the personalities and what's going on there psychically and so on. But let me know what you how that kind of lands.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. A lot of beautiful stuff that you said, and just was kind of taking it all in, just kind of basking in it. And hmm, yeah, it's just, I'm just kind of struck in the moment by how there's really, like, in theory, an infinite number of potential data points or issues that a person could dial in on when speaking about an event of this magnitude. And people on both sides are basically, just by the nature of what language is and how we can communicate it all, you're forced to cherry pick, like, you know, a tiny, tiny segment of available data points to that, and assemble them in an arrangement that feels like a compelling argument in one direction. And meanwhile, there's like an infinity of other potential issues or data points, just like all around that could be swirled into endless other configurations. And
Oh, I just lost your audio.
am I back? I'm back.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, my mic's been a little tricky lately, but anywho, some people might hear.
Oh, I think I just lost you one more time.
Did you lose me? We're gonna go.
Yeah.
We're gonna go with the built-in mic now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hear you.
So anywho, some people might hear that and feel like it's kind of like spiritual bypassing, or it's nihilistic, or it's saying like we can't possibly make coherent sense out of what's going on. But I don't really see it that way. I feel like what I'm saying is more like, feels to me more like a recognition of how reality actually is in its infinity, in its unresolvability, in its literally limitless complexity. So my focus is still being drawn to the unresolvability of it. And I think, you put together a really cool introductory frame for why you feel drawn toward the Unity Party, and I think that's very valid, and I resonate with a lot of what you said. Freedom of speech. Yeah, I find it interesting that there really hasn't been. There was maybe a couple points where I had the slightest inkling of like, oh, should I actually vote for Kamala? But for the most part, I've had like no intuition or inkling to vote for the Democrats at all. I think, especially after what happened during the COVID years, for me at least, for the way my human personality is configured, with its unique biases and its desire for radical freedom and radical sovereignty, and stay the fuck away from me, leave me alone with your bullshit. I don't want to put your mask on. I don't want to inject myself with your experimental shit. Um, just to see that authoritarian shadow that came out during the COVID years, to me was like a big like, whoa, stay away from me, and a big, revelation about the dark side of the Democratic Party. And so, yeah, I haven't, and so yeah, that's one of the big reasons why I wouldn't vote for them, among other reasons. But then I look at, so then my natural instinct is to lean more toward like, oh, I should just go against them and vote for whoever's not them. But then I look at the Trump side of things, and I can see equally questionable stuff. I can easily select a lot of data points and say, what Elon Musk is doing with X is not the creation of a pure free speech platform. It's the creation of a platform where the algorithm boosts Elon's tweets 1,000 times more than anyone else. And it's literally like a listen to Elon Musk tell you how the world should be platform, among many other things. It could be seen in many ways, but it certainly has its own biases, is what I'm trying to say, and it certainly has its own ways of massively distorting and manipulating reality for those who are spending a lot of time within that particular echo chamber or reality tunnel. Or I could point at the fact that there are tens of thousands of militiamen that have now gathered as part of the MAGA movement, that include police officers and firemen and ex-military guys, and these people are meeting up and executing drills, and doing drills with guns and practicing for potential military action that they may need to take. Some of these paramilitary militias have reached literally into the tens of thousands. They've utilized Facebook groups to recruit, and they've been building a kind of like MAGA military. And when you look at that type of activity, when you look at the kind of cult of personality that's formed around Donald Trump, and the kind of, I would say, a parallel reality that some of these people have been sucked into due to Trump's really extremist rhetoric about like, we are literally about to lose the country to an absolute onslaught of rapists and murderer criminal immigrants, and the media absolutely cannot in the slightest be trusted. None of them can be trusted. All the journalists are fake news. You can't trust anything anymore. You can't trust anyone. Trump is certainly not a figure who seems to be recognizing the divinity of the other guys. His rhetoric is extremely dehumanizing and divisive, and he seems to have the capacity to whip people into an absolute frenzy, and an absolute, like, people would be ready to get out on the streets as part of a MAGA militia and do God knows what. And I don't see that same type of threat coming from Kamala. I don't see that same type of military organization among the woke mob, campus protesters and such. So anywho, that's just one demonstration of like how you can arbitrarily select from. I mean, it's not arbitrary. It's a pattern matching mechanism, but you can select. There's just a veritable infinity of data points. You can select and make compelling arguments for both sides. But at the end of the day, again, I keep coming back to like, either way, it feels like you're dropping a stick of dynamite into the mine shaft with either candidate. It's you're dropping a stick of dynamite into the mine shaft of a 21st century America in decline that is in a very strange and precarious state with so many energies bubbling under the cauldron under the surface, and to try to predict the exact blast radius and the exact nature of the potential gold that could be unearthed or the potential decimation that could be wrought from either of those sticks of dynamite just feels like a fool's errand. Feels like a complete like uh, a fiction that that could be done in the slightest. And so, in a way, and again, I don't want to be defeatist about it, but that's kind of how it has seemed to me and why I've ended up where I've ended up in the the non-voting camp and in the camp. And to be less defeatist about it, I'll say this: what I talked a lot about with Corey the other day was that there are an infinity of other ways to vote that don't involve choosing between two, kind of joke candidates that are both controlled by the plutocracy once every 4 years. There are infinity other ways to vote which involve activating your own beingness and creating what you want to see in the world, being the message, being who you want to be. What are you being the love, being the truth, being the light, creating from that, shining that forth, emanating that, and literally creating the things that you want to see. That to me is like a much more empowered way of voting that I would like to teach that I will teach my children, that I would like to teach our children, rather than teaching them like, yeah, the way to affect change is you wait around and once every 4 years you get presented with two joke options and you flip a coin and, and choose the lesser of two evils and pray for the best, which is kind of what we're taught in America. So yeah, anywho, that's that's my ramble. Curious what that brings up.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, I had a great talk yesterday from Dr. Chris Beisch, who wrote a whole book about resonance in the classroom and really is working with the idea of fields, and that we generate fields individually, collectively. Those fields can have a quality that is beyond the individuals, and we can cultivate them, and um those are kind of like nested hierarchically, right? So he talks about like the field of each individual class he teaches develops, but then there's the field of the course, and new students will come through the class, but they're coming into the field of the course, and then that's going to be ultimately nested in cosmic fields. Um, so all of that is to say, it's very important that we're aware of the reality that we're generating fields of possibility. Um, and no, like I would say, no matter how existentially decided we are on one side or the other of that kind of Rorschach test, and I really liked the way you laid that out, like the nature of polarization, the nature of partisanship is this kind of like one side of the board comes forward, the other becomes invisible to us, right? So what is the spirit? What is the condition in which the person who is seeing one side of the board and the person who's seeing the other side of the board are both invited to the awareness that there's a field that they're generating, there's a field they're participating in, and how do they kind of leave that space even beyond their own conviction there? And in a practical sense, how do they hold some not knowing with the knowing and figure out how to land that and how to be with that so that it's not just pure anxiety, but it can actually start to be potential. That potential can start to be worked with, moved with. And I think one of the things that so inspired me in Robert F. Kennedy's campaign materials was that there was this, when he was running his own campaign, there was this freshness and there was this sense of calling in from deeper values. He had these videos talking about like the richness of the natural world and really kind of calling Americans to return to love of nature as something that, deeply unites the country. To recognize the divinity in nature, to recognize the divinity in one another. This is true leadership, and these are kinds of things that can um create that context in which not all is polarized, right? And maybe a lot of the sense of make America great again, um, it it points to many things. I think it points to coming to a place of confidence, coming to a place individually and collectively where one does not sort of negate oneself because of one's own shortcomings, because of one's own shadows. I often think that where we're kind of at with more the progressive deconstruction is like one side is like there's all this shadow, you're not seeing it, but it's going really quite far in that direction so that it's saying basically America is fundamentally evil. Um, and that I would say is too far. And the other side kind of wants to reject that. It's not ready to receive those shadows. It's not able to really process the sins of the past. And so it wants to go back to like a pre-shadow idea of itself, that kind of like good old-fashioned American ego. But what actually needs to occur is some sort of alchemical process in the American psyche of like integrating those shadows, ha having the identity of what it means to be American, kind of deconstruct and dissolve to some degree. But then out of that, there has to be that living spirit again. There has to be that hope. There has to be that kind of eagle, energy coming through. And that is kind of what I felt intonations of. That's what I felt I could start to see through what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was pointing towards. Um, and it's remarkable that, these messages of hope where they crop up are so often marginalized. We are working against systems that systematically exclude almost anything meaningful and hopeful. Um, and so it comes again to like that what is ours to do, right? What is ours to do as light workers, as people trying to create a space of hope and possibility? How do we relate to these machineries and power? And I think that there's something that I see in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and in Tulsi Gabbard, both former Democrats who've in some way realized that they need to go into the dark machine. They need to go into this kind of MAGA movement, which I agree has a potential for real darkness and kind of mob mentality. But to go inside of that and to try and kind of like enter inside and kind of start to move within it and start to like shift its animating center, and to take it over from the inside in a certain sense is what I see them doing. But that right now means this bargain with Donald Trump, he is the figurehead, he is the animating force behind that movement. And I do think he's being bettered by the people that he's in dialogue with now relative to years ago. Obviously, total combat and demonization doesn't bring out anyone's best self. Um, Having the other side call you Hitler, unhelpful. Um, and then, apologies if this is flowing a little bit chaotically, but that's the times we're in. Um, there's a kind of like bottom line reality that Donald Trump calls us towards, which is who is going to have those conversations, who's going to make the difficult deals. Um, he has proven some degree of prowess to connect across divides, and he can connect with people who are really morally ambiguous or completely debased. He's able to go to a Kim Jong Un. He's able to go to a Vladimir Putin. He's able to go to a, Bin Laden if he was still around. He could probably deal with a Bin Laden, and he has that capacity to work with dark forces on the basis of what is in pure business interest for the United States. Um, and I do think there's a significant positive diplomatic impact that can be identified from having him at the head. And it's complicated because the
I
US
do.
also hemorrhaged a lot of positive reputation amongst its allies at the same time. So, but if I have to choose a lead negotiator, do I choose the man who, has a proven capacity, or do I choose the the opposing figure who's avoided all interviews, avoids basically any context in which she actually has to speak unscripted? Um,
Yeah, I think it's
that's kind
a
of a bottom line version of it.
yeah, I think it's a fair point to make. I was just gonna jump in and say that I feel like you are giving Trump too much credit there, and that he's more of a wild card than that characterization paints him out to be. I mean, I just happened upon an old video I made back in 2018 where I was reacting to, I got apparently at the time really triggered by his tweets at to Kim Jong Un, where he was basically saying like, "Oh, you've got a button on your desk, Rocket Man. Well, I've got a bigger button on my desk, and I'll actually push it." Like he literally tweeted that to a like an insane world leader. Like tweeted like, "I have a bigger nuclear button on my desk, and I will push it, little Rocket Man." Like a guy who's doing something like that, that like there's no way to predict the outcome of that type of discourse. Like that's just irresponsible. And I think the vision of Trump as like the diplomatic kind of anti-war candidate that a lot of people on the right seem to be pushing doesn't quite map onto the fact that he implemented more drone strikes in his 4 years than Obama did during the previous 8 years prior to that, and the fact that Trump is extremely in favor of the war in Palestine, and has stated that Israel should just finish the job, whatever that means. So yeah, I don't know. I have some issues with this characterization of Trump as some kind of you know non-wild card who's a genius deal maker. And I'm not saying you're going full on with that characterization, but that would be my response to that. And just a couple more points that came up with what you were saying. um, I feel like, and you kind of touched on this, but I feel like the biggest issue that no one talks about at all, except for the kind of like meta political commentators like the Charles Eisensteins, I see the biggest issue as the war consciousness that characterizes modern American politics and probably politics more broadly, and the way that both sides do project their shadow onto the other side and project all of the evil onto the other side, and
Yeah.
can't do their own shadow work and own their own shadow, and can't be in the non-knowing, and can't see the light and shadow of both sides, and are unable to see everyone as being divine children of God that are worthy of love and respect, unconditional love. It's the lack of unconditional love, which is the only thing that can really dissolve that war consciousness. It's only the transcendence of that us and them mentality, and truly learning to love one's enemies. That's the only thing that can really take us where our hearts really want to go. And it's not easy, but it's so absent from the political discourse that it's from one perspective a disgrace, from another perspective it just is as it is, and then people are just at where they're at, and people are not apparently able to really feel and discuss at that level in the current political discourse. But part of that is actually due to the totally corrupted game architecture of the current political world, which is why I'm glad you brought up the fact that we are constantly creating these fields, collective fields of possibility and collective game worlds through, what we're emanating, what we're speaking into existence, how we're connecting with each other. And that was the point of that piece I wrote the other day, which I talked about with Corey some as well, which was essentially the current game world that modern American politics is so rancid, it's so foul, it's so difficult for even high sovereignty beings to wade into without becoming co-opted by this kind of divisive demon of war consciousness, that we really need an entirely new field of possibility. We need new vocabularies, because it really begins with the language. I mean, even more fundamentally, before language, it begins with just primordial stillness in and as divinity. And then from that, from the place where the word is with God, the word comes forth and the word shapes reality. And our vocabularies around politics are completely corrupted. And we entirely do need fresh and new blank slate, new vocabularies about collective intelligence and omni considerate collective decision making, and all of these kind of liminal web vocabularies that have been being innovated by the Daniel Schmachtenbergers and the Jordan Halls. They're actually, I think those guys have this meta awareness that we need new non-charged words that can allow us to actually play a new game and carve out a new game space, because the current one is just completely foul. Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing in the liminal web here as well and thinking about what's the role of that discourse in relation to the political. One observation that Chris Beisch made in relationship to his experience as a teacher was that his own spiritual processes were having indirect but very significant effects on all of his students through this field effect. So when he was going through these deep death and healing processes, it was triggering and catalyzing processes in his students who did not know about what was going on privately for him. So there's a non-direct field effect. And he really put forward the argument that all um, all healing work, all consciousness work is ultimately collective. There's no such thing as private healing ultimately, because all of it is rippling out, all of it is having effect. So if we take that on, we can say that the energetic field of the political sits in relationship to the larger field of culture and the field of consciousness that people within culture are holding down. So the first thing that is essential in that is for there to be a space which is somehow beyond the political. If the political is broken, then there has to be something beyond political for solutions, for new ways of thinking, for new languages, for new spirits to emerge that can then kind of re-flow back in, that can repenetrate the political. And so, what is that is a really important question for us to think about, not just right now on the eve of the election, but continuing forward, because ultimately, um, the way to kind of carve through these waves is to have a project that is not contingent on either party, you know? That's what I saw when I listened to Rick Doblin from Maps this weekend. He's managed to create bipartisan support for this work with bringing forward psychedelics, particularly MDMA, for healing trauma. And he found a leverage point through veterans that was able to unite left and right around that. So, independent of whoever wins, they have the orientation, they have their goal, they know what they need to do. They've got to get this legislation through, they got to build these healing centers all around the world, they got to develop these practices. Um, and I think the same can be true of the liminal web. There are new spaces, new contexts of education, new contexts of social development, new ways of developing language to approach the political. Perhaps equally important to all of that, the skills, the capacities to actually hold the political. These need to be trained. We need kind of meta political monks and warriors who are so deeply, deeply devoted to that that they can take that really impossible war consciousness energy and encounter it and still stay connected and kind of bring the light of a fuller consciousness into those conversations, even all the while themselves, like having political orientations, not being just like totally free of the political, but somehow being political and being beyond political at the same time, with the beyond political being the more important of the two. Um, and in that way, those people you could imagine would be participating in this beyond political cultural space, whether it's the liminal web, whether it's various kind of uh, spiritual communities, churches, different kinds of associations, where they're developing that capacity and rootedness that they can then go into the political. And some of them might be more drawn to the progressive, some of them might be more drawn to the Republican side, but that they would then enter into that space as kind of like it would be like half blue, half light. And you could have people that are half red and half light. And so they're kind of in the political, but they're kind of beyond it. And so they're kind of creating that, they're kind of embodying that bridge between the political and the beyond political through the participation in it. And I think what I see that does give me hope, and what I've spoken to a little bit in relationship to my sense that whilst Donald Trump doesn't seem to be changing as a person, the quality of the Trump we get is affected a lot by the context he shows up in. And when he's doing a CNN or a town, like a big rally or a hostile interview, you get the worst Trump. But when you put him in with the Joe Rogan, you put him in with a Tucker Carlson, or you put him in with these more conversationalist long form, you do get a better quality, and it calls forth a better quality. And I think that there is a network war going on right now between a more centralized and shadowy control structure, which I associate with supporting the Democratic Party, and a kind of rebellious counter structure, which people like Elon, people like Tucker Carlson, and others are kind of participating in. And what's very encouraging about that group in particular is they seem to be open to a greater degree. There seems to be more of a interconnectedness going on between that kind of unity network and like a broader network, which I would say is more meta political, or closer to a kind of liminal web, closer to these kind of centers of wisdom. So I think it is ultimately coming back. It's through the networks of communication, it's through the quality of the field that we're generating, and through those dialogues that what is outside the political, what is beyond the political, can begin to actually shift the quality and the energy of the political through its encounter with it. Um, yeah, that's uh, that's where I'd leave that.
Hmm. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful points there. Um, And yeah, I feel just to say as well that I do think there are also a lot of people on the left or supporting the Democrats that are also part of the liminal web or part of the sense-making web or even the intellectual dark web and or tangentially connected to these spaces. So I think it's, it's not so simple as to just say that the MAGA movement is more connected to those spaces. So I just want to offer that challenge to a potential, it's just a little too neat and tidy of a narrative, right? And it kind of overlooks like the fact that Elon Musk and Donald Trump, you know, these guys are incredibly wealthy individuals, and who knows what kind of networks of wealth and power they're connected to, right? Like no one in this election is even talking about the fact that the global 1% currently own about 80 to 90% of the wealth on the planet. It's like of the, the mono the calculable wealth. I don't know the exact numbers. The other day I saw 1% owns 90%, but then someone was questioning the validity of that. So I don't know exactly what it is, but it's like an enormity. And the fact that that's not even discussed, that we live in this global plutocracy where 1% of people own, let's say, 80% of the wealth, and the other 99% squabble over the remaining 1/5 of the pie. And neither party is talking at all about changing that in any kind of deep systemic way. That should tell you something about where where the deepest egregore of both parties is really aligned to, where the real center of gravity is. And I don't know. I think it's follow the money, cash rules everything around me. It's yeah, I want to be hopeful too, but it's incredibly scary how people get co-opted by wealth and power. And even just seeing some of the rhetoric coming out of even RFK and Tulsi as they've, become kind of absorbed somewhat by the MAGA party and have, begun taking more divisive and more fear-mongering type stances toward immigrants and things of this nature. It's just even high integrity individuals can be co-opted by these egregorical shadows, these kind of dark magical intelligences that are afoot in this world, and afoot in the plutocracy that controls a vast amount of it. So yeah, I don't know. That's one other narrative or that could be plucked out of the infinity of potential narratives and frames applied to this whole thing. Do you have any closing words, my friend, before I say a short closing prayer for America and close the space tonight?
I think it's really important to maintain the connection with the heart. I think that's a very important compass point throughout the stormy seas ahead. And no matter what's going on in the head, no matter what's going on in the mind, if there can be that connection with the heart, true connection with the heart, that is, I think that will help keep us in good stead, and that will shore us up against temptations to become demonically possessed by the demonization of others. Um, so stay true to the heart, stay true to the inner truth, maintain that golden thread. Don't get drawn away by the riches or by the terrors that are presented on either side. And yeah, this ultimately is not something we can do alone. We have to do it together, and we have to do it with, with spiritual support, with ancestral support, with divine support, and with really well held collective spaces. So I hope that our leaders can find themselves supported in all of those ways.
Beautiful. Absolutely love that. Thank you for that. And yeah, I just want to offer in this moment, just want to conclude by offering a prayer for America and for Earth at this time, for Kamala Harris, for Donald Trump, for the Democrats, the Republicans, and all the people who identify as neither. Just for planet Earth right now, may love touch all of our hearts, and may we let go of our demonization and realize that we are all one body, that we are all children of God, that we are all created inherently equal, and may we see each other at equal eye level through the eyes of love. May we bring love to this world. May we heal this world. Lord, be with us. God, be with us. Love, be with us. Prayers for all. Amen. For the highest good. Amen.